If you've been following along in Core 52, then you know that this week's message is about money. And if you've read it already, then you've read these points. But if you haven't, let me draw your attention to kind of just some of the opening paragraphs. With the opening paragraphs, the author, Mark Moore, kind of draws attention to a few things. 10% of the gospel verses are about money. So the gospels being Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the stories about Jesus. 10% of their content is about money. 16 of the 38 parables that Jesus told were either about money or possessions. 2,300 verses in the Bible about money compared to last week's topic of prayer at just 500. I think all of those stats come together to illustrate one very powerful point, that money is a big deal. Right? So on the count of three, if you could just with me, just say, it's a big deal. 1, 2, 3. It's a big deal. Right? Money is a big deal. And if you don't think it's a big deal, just try not to pay your rent for a few months. Right? Go to work, and work, even if the boss doesn't pay you. The customers, they don't pay for the merchandise or the services they receive. Money is a big deal. Right? And it's a big deal for God as well. And the way that we manage our money tells us a lot about whether or not the statement on our money, our currency, is actually true. In God we trust. Right? Because there's a lot of ways that we manage our money or don't manage our money that just kind of illustrate maybe a different picture. In our government we trust, or in ourselves we trust, in our stuff we trust, but we really need to come back around to this idea that it's in God that we trust. And our core verse for this message is found in Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 through 20. It's going to be on the screens in front of you. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures where? On earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But instead lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth or rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. So there's two different types of treasures. One that's temporary, that's here on earth, and the other that's eternal, and it's towards heaven, right? Everything is focused heaven-bound. Now, before we unpack this a little bit more so, I want to share with you, there's one more verse to this little section. It says, where your money is, there your heart will be also. I've been talking about different topics in church, and money being one of them, for long enough that it really doesn't bother me to talk about money. I've kind of come to grips with it. As a matter of fact, I feel like I'm actually robbing you of blessings if we don't talk about money. But I think it's important to say that God isn't really that concerned about your money. He's more concerned about your heart. Where your money is, there your heart will be also. Now, I can say that and in the same breath go, yeah, but as a church plant, we really like your money. Like, there's a carnal piece to this. There's this idea that, I like the Eagles Club and I want to love on the Eagles Club as long as we can love on the Eagles Club, but if we can get our own place, that'd be awesome. Right? I like to say, there are so many great volunteers who are putting in so many great hours, and we could just live off of volunteers, but that wouldn't be true. Right? That there is within us this fleshly need, like, okay, it'd be nice to maybe make sure that we're paying our bills and we're paying our staff and things like that. But I want to share with you that the most pressing of all of this is that God desires your heart. And I'm going to take you on a bit of a journey through some Old Testament passages. And if you're not familiar with the Old Testament, you're about to get a little bit more familiar. And if you are familiar with the Old Testament, I'm hoping that maybe by pushing some of these passages together and maybe highlighting a few key pieces, then maybe you'll come across some new information that you haven't seen before. So let's start at Genesis chapter 4. So Genesis is the very first book of the Bible. And if you're in the Bibles, we provide page number, I believe it's 3. Genesis chapter 4. And so we see that He's moved on from creating Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve have had a couple of boys. Their names are Cain and Abel. And it says in verse 3, in the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of the fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. Now, Cain became very angry in this situation. He ended up killing his brother out in the field. But why? Like, they both brought an offering before God. They both acknowledge that God is an important piece of their success. But why the difference? Why did God look with regard on the sacrifice of Abel, but not that of Cain? And I'm going to lead you into something that I've heard called the principle of the firsts. And so with Cain, what he is offering is an offering of the first fruits. Okay, this is like saying God has blessed me with a lot of things, and rather than tithe the 10% of what God has given me, giving that back to him, I give him a portion of that tithe back to him. And what we see then on Abel's side of things is Abel is actually taking the firstborn, the very first one of his flock, and he's laying that down as a sacrifice. Okay, so both of these tie into that same principle, and we'll come back around to that. If we read on in chapter 15, we see the story of Abraham. Abraham's story actually spreads through many chapters in the book of Genesis. But Abraham, in chapter 15, page 10, it says, "After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram," same guy, "in a vision. 'Fear not, Abram, I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great.'" God is promising a blessing to Abram. Abram's got a problem, though. It says, Abram said to him, "O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eleazar of Damascus." And Abraham said, "Behold, you have given me no offspring, and a member of my household will be my heir." And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, "This man shall not be your heir. Your very own son shall be your heir." And he brought him outside and said, "Look toward the heaven and number the stars, and if you are able to number them." And he said to him, "So shall your offspring be." And he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. So I think probably most of us would be in that same boat. Okay, God, you said you're going to bless me. That if I'm looking around, God, I'm not feeling very blessed right now. I'm feeling like this thing in my life is causing a challenge. Maybe you're really struggling to find that special someone to spend your life with. Maybe you're struggling to get over some addiction, and God has not given you just a miraculous answer to that. Maybe you're struggling to have children, just like Abram and Sarai were struggling to have kids. And so you bring that to God, you bring that to his attention, and God walks him outside, and he says, "Look at the stars. Look at the stars. Count them. Go ahead. I dare you. Count them. Try. Your offspring is going to be as numerous as the stars." If I would have been Abram, chances are if you would have been Abram, there's a really good chance we would have been like, "Yeah, right." But it says that Abram believed, and it was counted to him as righteousness. And then just a couple pages later in chapter 22, we see the story kind of continue. Abram is without kids. He's promised to have kids. And it says in chapter 22, verse 1, "And these things God tested Abram and said to him, 'Abraham,' and he said, 'Here I am.' So take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains, which I shall tell you." Let me link these passages together. So Abraham believed, it was counted to him as righteousness. God eventually blessed him. He had, at an old age, a son, Isaac. Now, there was some other stuff that kind of happened in there where they tried to, fix the problem themselves. Not that we ever do that. But Abram was finally given this promised child, a child that was of both him and his wife Sarah. And after God gives him this son, and he raises him up, he's probably a teenager at this point. Now God steps into his life and says, now I want you to go sacrifice him. Like, dude, what? Hello? Like, this is not what I signed up for. Numerous as the stars, I've only got one. You can imagine. Anybody here that's a parent can imagine that this must have been an extremely difficult ask. And yet Abraham did it. Not that he sacrificed his son, but did you catch the part where it says God tested him? God tested him. Will you do it? Will you give this up for me? And so Abraham was willing to offer the sacrifice, but whenever they got to that moment, God provided a substitute, another sacrifice, an offer and an opportunity for redemption in that moment. And both of these stories, whether it's Cain and Abel's sacrifice or Abraham and Isaac, like they leave some big questions, like what is God doing here? And maybe there's some things in your life where you kind of are left with more questions than answers. But as we turn over to Exodus chapter 13, so Genesis, Exodus, just the next book over, in chapter 13, page 55, you're going to see this plague of the firsts kind of explained a little bit more so. In between Abraham and chapter 13 of Exodus, we see something amazing going on. First of which, God provides for the Israelites. There's a time of famine, and they're able to go down to Egypt and eat. They're taken care of. His provision is amazing through a guy named Joseph, who rose to be second in command from being a slave. And then we see that Pharaoh had died, and a new Pharaoh took over, and he was afraid that the Israelites were going to outnumber their own people and just come in and have their own way. And so in his fear, he subjected the Israelites to horrible slavery, and they were laying bricks, and they were not able to rest, and they had to go gather their own materials, and they were whining and complaining to God, and God, through his divine provision, he has this guy named Moses, who's an Israelite, but it's raised in the house of Pharaoh for just this opportunity, right? To come in and say, hey, Pharaoh, let my people go. And so reluctantly, Moses, who apparently had trouble speaking, comes in and he challenges what would be his brother in this type of thing. And so his staff becomes a snake. The magicians, they replicate that. There's a series of 10 plagues. The first few, the magicians are replicating that, which has always been an amazement to me because they only make bad situations worse instead of actually providing a solution. But some horrible plagues, and you can read through them in the opening chapters of Exodus. And then you get to the very last plague because they're playing this yo-yo thing. They're saying, hey, Pharaoh, we need to go. Pharaoh says no, and they say, okay, well, here's the bad plague, the thing that's going to happen, and it happens. And then he goes, okay, that's bad. I don't want that anymore. I'm sorry. And so then the whole cycle repeats and repeats and repeats, and then you get to number 10. And number 10 is so bad, it's the plague of the firstborn. And so every firstborn, whether it's man or of animal, it's going to die. Unless, because there's a certain caveat for the Israelites, you kill this unblemished lamb and you put the blood around the doorframe of your house, and the angel of death will pass over you. And that's where we get this term, the Passover. And this is all taking place before we get to chapter 13. So the plague of the firstborn and the Passover. And in chapter 13, verse 1, it says this: the Lord said to Moses, consecrate to me all the firstborn. Whatever is the first to open the womb among the people of Israel, both man and beast, it's mine. So for every animal, for every man that's to be born, it belongs to who? To God. This is a very important part of the principle. The firstborn belongs not to you and I, but to God. And so if that's the case, then it's really not ours to hold on to. But that doesn't keep us from trying to hold on to it. As a matter of fact, I think that sometimes when we try to hold on to the first, it actually blocks us from greater blessings. If Abraham would have tried to hold on to Isaac, it would have probably blocked him from receiving the blessings of descendants as numerous as the stars. Right? But there was a test. And so for you and I, it could be simple things like this. You know, we have our very first job, and our very first job is horrible. We hate all the employees. We hate all the management. We wish we'd never gone there, and we want nothing to do with that. And so we really don't want to take another job like it because we're probably going to hate that one too. Right? And we've allowed the first one to define all of the rest. Or we go in and it's a pretty good experience and we're doing all right and nothing really changes and we don't really get much of a promotion, but we're still kind of just happy sitting there doing our thing because, you know, hey, it's not changing me too much. I can kind of go through the motions, do what I've always been doing, and I never really get the blessings of going on to something else because I'm still stuck in the first. And maybe it happens, you know, because you've been hurt in a relationship. And because of the baggage of that relationship, you don't really want to engage in the next relationship. Or one relationship is going so well, and how could I possibly find somebody else that would measure up to this? And then it spills over to our kids, right? Being a guy, I don't really know the pain associated with having a child, but I was there when all three of mine were born. And so I had a window into that world, and I understand that there's some pain involved. And if every woman would ever just stop because of the pain of the first, there would not be a second, third, fourth, or whatever. But somehow God just miraculously takes away those memories of pain. I don't know how he does that. And eventually, you know, it's like, oh, hey, let's have another. So this is the principle of firsts. And I believe that offering your first takes faith. Right? Where was it that Abraham challenged, or God challenged Abraham? Was it when he had a second child or a third child? When he had others to fill in the gap? No, he had to be willing to sacrifice before he ever got to number 2 or 3 or 4. And I believe that God is sometimes going to call you and I to make sacrifices that are a little more than blind faith. Because we're going to say, you know, God, I can't leave this job because I don't know what I'm going to. But somewhere in the core of your being, you're going to feel God inside of you saying, I got this. I got this. And if you really want to experience the greater blessing, you're going to need to cut this tie. And maybe you're in a bad, hurting relationship, but that's all you know. And God's saying you need to stop this. And inside you're thinking, I don't know if I can ever find anybody else. Somebody who's going to love me for me. Somebody who's going to put up with my stuff. And maybe in that moment God's going to say, you know, hey, trust me. I got this. And I think sometimes that principle carries over to money. Right? Because you and I, we can get so locked in. This is all I got. This is all I got, God. And if I give you this and I have to live on 90%, that's scary. And I'm not so sure, God, that I can do that. And so why don't we just flip the script a little bit? How about I'll work with the 90%, and when I get down to the leftovers, then God, I'll make an offering to you. Which kind of kicks back to Genesis chapter 4, Cain and Abel. One who was giving of their firstborn, and the other who was giving an offering out of the first crop. There's a difference, right? And so many times I think as a church we can do a disservice because we can say, you know, hey, God loves a cheerful giver. Give what you've already decided to give in your heart, and I believe that that's true. But the problem is that we forget that the first tenth doesn't belong to us. And so then we were left with this awkward dilemma. You see in Malachi chapter 3, this is the very last book of the Old Testament, the prophet Malachi is giving us this word of wisdom in which God says, you know, you are stealing from me. And they're like, how are we stealing? In tithes and offerings. You're bringing the blemished right? You're bringing the leftovers into me. Your heart's really not in it. You're really not putting me first. You know, and God, again, He's wanting the heart. He's wanting the heart, but their actions are telling God that their heart is not in it. And so He's like, I just wish you'd shut the doors. Like go do your thing, whatever that is. But stop bringing these animals into me. They mean nothing to me without your heart. And so then we're really left with two options, right? If the first tenth belongs to God, either we return it to God, because you can't give it because you don't own it. Either you return it to God or you steal it for yourself. I'm hoping that this maybe opens our minds a little bit. Because I think so many times it's like, well, you know, if I just go, it's kind of like an event. I'll just go and I'll just put a little in. And by all means, like we want you to take whatever little step of faith that God has in your life. But I don't want you to miss out on the greater blessings because you're afraid of sacrificing your first. And when we learn to sacrifice the first, I believe that it opens up the floodgates. And it actually says in Malachi, put me to the test. Right? See that I don't just open up the floodgates of heaven and fill your vats to overflowing. But we struggle to believe that. But I want to share with you another principle in this same chapter that really echoes this. Starting in verse 12, it says, and maybe I'll just back up to verse 11 so we have the full sentence. When the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites that He swore to you and your fathers, and shall give it to you, you shall set apart to the Lord all that first opens the womb. All the firstborn of the animals that are males shall be the Lord's. Every firstborn of a donkey you shall redeem with a lamb. And if you will not redeem it, you shall break its neck. Every firstborn of a man among your sons you shall redeem. So there's two types of animals listed here. The clean and the unclean. If you've read through the Bible, if you've dug into the Old Testament, you've probably seen this, and probably like many other of those details in the Old Testament, you kind of get bogged down by them and you go, you know what? I don't know really what that means, so I'm just going to kind of read it and forget about it. And so there's two types of animals, the clean and the unclean. So which animal in the text represents the clean? Anybody? The lamb. And which animal represents the unclean? The donkey. All right, so two animals that are here. Now, the thing that this kind of tells us is that it parallels into our life. So there's two types of animals listed within the Old Testament, the clean and the unclean. Which one do you suppose represents you and I? A bunch of donkeys. Right? So we are unclean, right? Because we were all born with a sin nature. We've all sinned and we've all fallen short of the glory of God. And so for those of us that have been unclean, the only hope that we have is to be redeemed. And how do you redeem something that's unclean? You sacrifice the thing that's clean. So if the donkey has another donkey, you go over to the lamb and you sacrifice the lamb so that you can keep the donkey. And it really, in our human intellect, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It's kind of crazy. But this is the way that adds up. Jesus is oftentimes referred to as the lamb. And would you say that Jesus is unclean or clean? Clean. So throughout the Old Testament, when we see the clean and the unclean, when we see the sacrifices and the redemption, what we're really seeing is that there is what is unclean, you and I, and the only way to redeem what is unclean is through the sacrifice of that which is clean, Jesus. Maybe that's a new bit of information. Maybe that kind of stirs something inside of you that whenever God is saying, I want the first and I want it to be redeemed, that the only way that it's redeemed is through the blood of Jesus, the pure sacrifice. Matter of fact, if we read on in chapter 14 or verse 14, it says, and when in time to come your son asks you, what does this mean? You shall say to him, by a strong hand the Lord brought us up out of Egypt. from the house of slavery. This is right after the Exodus. They've been enslaved in Egypt. Now they've been delivered powerfully through these 10 plagues, led into the desert, to the wilderness. God has given them all of these do's and do nots in the Old Testament. And here among them in chapter 13 is this idea of the clean and the unclean, the being willing to sacrifice the firstborn. And at some point in time, the little boy comes into the room and he goes, "Hey, Dad, what's up?" I thought we were just super excited that, Bessie had a baby and this was going to be awesome. Well, son, let me tell you, Bessie was the firstborn. And whenever we left Egypt, we were pretty unclean. We went through some pretty difficult stuff. It was only by the mighty power of God when He stepped in that we were delivered, and it's only through the redemption of God that we can be saved. I wonder if maybe you and I don't have a story similar to that. And it says that we're to write these stories in our heart and we're to teach them to our kids. Right? How powerful of a story is it whenever you and I can have conversations with our kids and they can go, "Why are you doing that? I just wrote out a check for 10% of my income and I gave it to the church." The kids see that and they go, "Dude, that's a lot of money. Why would you do that? You could buy a new whatever with that." Or you know what? I got my giving statement for the end of the year just like everybody else. And I went, "Oh, dude, I could have paid some debt down with that. I didn't realize I gave that much money. That's really cool." And I start to begin to think through this process that I never missed one of those dollars. Never once. Because when I gave first to God, He blessed the rest. And 90% with God is way more powerful than 100% without Him. Because God will actually limit your blessings because you don't trust in Him. And some of us here, we've had limited blessings in our life because we don't trust God. And I believe financially as a church, one of the things that holds us back from greater blessings is because we have people in the church body that don't trust God. And that's hard. But God wants to give us greater blessings. And so I would ask you, do you believe that God has redeemed you from some pretty rough stuff? Now, maybe you're in that position in life, you're still going through the rough stuff, and I get that. But so many of us, we're sitting here today because somebody introduced us to the life-saving grace of Jesus Christ. Right? He redeemed us from whatever, fill in the blank. Right? And this is what our life used to be like, but with Jesus, our life is different. And in Matthew chapter 19, there's this story. It's of a rich young ruler. Matthew 19, page 824. And the basic premise of this rich young ruler is that he wants to know what he can do to inherit eternal life. It's a pretty good question. I think it's valid. And so Jesus begins to speak to him. And so he offers him things like, keeping the commandments. You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, honor your father and mother, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. All of these kind of go back to the 10 Commandments. And the young man is like, "I'm gold. I've done it. I got all those things on lock. It is good to go." And he's like, "So is there anything else?" And to which Jesus says, "Yeah, sell everything you have and give it to the poor." What? What? I've just done all of this stuff and now you want my money? Jesus, we can't go there. Right? We can't go there. But he forgets that one of the underlying commands is do not covet. Do not covet. And it kind of infiltrates all of the rest. Right? It puts a greed within our hearts, and on our dollars we write, "In myself I trust," rather than "In God I trust." And I wonder if maybe your life would ever get to the point where you would say, you know what, it's God that I trust. And it's to God that I would gladly give, because God gladly gave for me. You see, when I was lost, when I was hurting, when I was helpless, when I was unclean in the eyes of God, that's when he offered his first to me. Colossians chapter 1, verse 15 says that Jesus was the firstborn of all of creation. Firstborn of all creation. So the firstborn of the creation was sacrificed in my place. In Revelation chapter 1, it says that he was the firstborn from among the dead to be raised to life. It's through the sacrifice of Jesus that my death is atoned for, but new life is promised. And that's something we ought to lean in on. I'm going to share with you one more story. This is found in Joshua chapter 6 and 7. So if we put this on the timeline, so we've got Cain and Abel, and then we get to Abraham and Isaac, then we get the whole Exodus story. And so Moses is supposed to lead the Israelites into the promised land. The Israelites, they're rebellious, kind of like you and I, and so they end up wandering for a while. And Moses does some stuff that Moses isn't supposed to do, and so he ends up dying with a lot of other people in the wilderness. And so Joshua is left to lead the charge into the promised land, and one of the first places they come up against is Jericho. And Jericho is a fortified city, and there's no possible way that they're going to get in, except for God provides some miraculous way that they march around the walls once a day for 6 days, blowing some trumpets, and on the seventh day they go around 6 extra times, blow some trumpets and yell, and the walls just come tumbling down. It's crazy. And so they attack Jericho, which really isn't much of an attack. They've already fallen before them because God is all-powerful, and God tells them not to take the stuff that's sacred inside of the city. And Achan is taking actually some stuff that doesn't belong to him. It was supposed to be consecrated, set apart, holy to the Lord, and Achan takes some of it. You can read about it in Joshua 6 and 7. So they go from that battle, that amazing victory, right, where they had to hardly do anything. Hey guys, let's go for a walk. And God provides the victory. To the next battle, they couldn't win it. They couldn't win it. And Joshua didn't know what to do, but when he was bowing before God, God opened his eyes and he said, somebody has taken what's holy to me. The unfortunate thing is that they needed to make that right, so Achan and all of his family were led away and stoned to death. But by driving out the evil and the sin within their camp, they were able to experience greater blessings that God had before them. And when you and I set our minds to holding on to the holy things of God, unfortunately, we put a roadblock in our path to experiencing the greater blessings of God. And for you and I, biblically, to experience the greater blessings of God, Malachi, test me and see that if I don't pour out, it means that we're willing to sacrifice of the first and of the best. And so here's my challenge for you. One challenge that I think is powerful, and that is trust God. Put him to the test. Do exactly what it says in Malachi. And for the next 90 days, 3 months, take 10% of your income. Now, some of you are probably already processing this. Does he mean gross income or net income? Because, you know, Uncle Sam takes out quite a bit, and so I'd rather just go off the net. And I would say, is it in your government that you trust or in God? And if you can answer that question, then that'll tell you whether it's gross or it's net. Because I can tell you that I don't owe the government the salvation of my life. Right? That is not where my redemption comes from. That is not what holds my hope. And so I want to challenge you to be thinking about that. I want to challenge you. If it's not Connection, I get that, right? Because this is a self-promoting cause. And if you give to Connection, you give to the pastors. The pastors tithe, by the way, as do other leaders in the church, right? But if you're reluctant to give to Connection, find a ministry and give to them. Put God to the test over the next 90 days. Give it to Youth and Families for Christ. Give it to the Columbus Rescue Mission, right? Give it to Forge Christian Church in Hastings, Nebraska. But put God to the test and see that if he doesn't just come through for you. I probably should put this caveat in here. It probably doesn't mean you're going to be driving a Bentley at the end of 90 days. because I don't kind of go that way. It's more like God sometimes blesses you with health and benefits. He makes ways where there's no other ways. And there's times, and I've heard some of our guys get up and deliver the offering message and go, you know what? I don't know how we did it. We gave, we had less money, and God fulfilled our needs better than he's ever filled our needs before. Because God is an amazing God, and that's the way he works. But we have to decide whether to put him to the test.